Hey, it is so good to be back in Reed Arena. It's great to be back at Breakaway. I have missed you dearly. If this is our first time in the room together, my name is Timothy Atik. I'm the former director of Breakaway, and I just love this place. And I love what God has been doing at Breakaway over the last semester. I've just tracked with you guys from Dallas, and it's just such a good reminder that the Spirit of God is the one who does the work. And the Spirit of God has been moving in Aggieland at Breakaway all semester long, and I'm just so encouraged, and yet I miss you, and so it's good to see you. Back in the fall, I just let you in on an important thing in my life, and some of you remember it, others of you guys don't, but I decided that I wanted to become the GOAT, the greatest of all time in the 41-year-old age bracket of tennis in the Bryan College Station area. That's a true deal. And now that goal has just transitioned to Richardson, Texas, and I plan to be the greatest of all time in the 41-year-old age bracket of tennis in Richardson, Texas. My journey with tennis started when I was really young, and just to be clear, I'm terrible at tennis. I'm just gonna say that right now. So I've got a long way to go to becoming the GOAT. But at an early age, my brother and I, we just became infatuated with this very famous tennis player at the time. His name was Andre Agassi. We've got a picture of Andre because the majority of you probably have no clue who that was. He had this sweet mullet and he wore, neon colors, and we just thought that was incredible. We wanted to be just like him, and so we actually bought his clothes, and we still have his clothes to this day. I went over to my brother's house recently and I tried them on, and so you can just see if you throw up the next picture. That's kind of that. And so I love tennis, but I kind of fell away from tennis for decades. And then after I read Andre Agassi's biography last summer, I was like, that's it. I'm going to become the GOAT. The problem with wanting to become the GOAT is that I can't hit a forehand in tennis. Backhand, no problem. Forehand, very problematic for me. And the reason why is because I lost all hand-eye coordination in 6th grade. Like, I remember the day. I remember being in PE and playing kickball and needing to throw the ball to first base. And when I threw it, first base was here, home plate was here, and my throw went somewhere in the middle. And I was like, I planned to throw it to first. It didn't go to first. I've lost all hand-eye coordination, so I'll just become a runner because you don't have to use your hands. You just put one foot in front of the other as fast as you can, and that worked out for me. But I'm into tennis now. The problem is I can't hit a forehand, and so I watch YouTube videos on how to hit a forehand. I remember I bought this bag of tennis balls, and I went over to A&M College Station High School's tennis courts, and it was like a really sad sight. Like, I would just drop a ball and hit it over to the other side. There was no one on the other side. I was just trying to figure out how to hit. And some balls went over the fence, others just went nowhere. And I remember this one time that these 3 guys were on another court, and I could tell that they needed another player. And so I was like, please pick me. And I could tell they were looking at me, and then they just decided to play without me. I was like, makes sense. I couldn't hit a forehand. And then one of you stepped into my life, and your name is Austin, and you took me to the tennis court. And you were like, okay, I told you it's not possible for me to hit a forehand. You just went to work, Austin. And you were like, you need to change this, you need to tweak this, you need to hold your racket this way. And slowly but surely, there came this day where I had this out-of-body experience where I was just every forehand I hit was just perfect. Don't ask Austin if that's actually how it went down. That's just how I remember it, at least in my mind. And when I moved to Dallas, I started working with a guy named John, and he continued to hone my forehand. And so even this past week, I was like, I am amazing at tennis. Because what was impossible alone was possible with Austin and John. Like a miracle had taken place in my life. The balls that were soaring over the fence or into the creek were now landing in the court. Praise Jesus. That's really all I wanted to share with you tonight. My forehand's coming along. Let's pray, and we can get out of here. That's really all I had for you. I tell you that because tonight I want to talk about this idea of spiritual growth, spiritual understanding, spiritual maturity. Like, I would imagine that a good amount of people in the room desire to be spiritually mature people. And if I were to ask you, what does it take to be spiritually mature? My fear is if I were to sit down with you for coffee and I were to ask you, what does it look like to be a spiritually mature person? You would just talk to me about spiritual activity. You'd say, well, you read your Bible regularly, you pray consistently, and you serve faithfully. You would just talk to me about spiritual activity. But spiritual activity only tells you whether you're disciplined or not. It doesn't speak to whether you are actually spiritually mature or not. And so what I want to help you understand tonight is that spiritual maturity, like growing into maturity, is actually a miracle. It is. It only comes about by God through the power of His Spirit doing a work in your life. So spiritual maturity is not about spiritual activity as much as it is about spiritual availability to the Spirit of God doing a work in your life. Because what is impossible alone, just like me on the tennis court, unable to hit a forehand, what is impossible alone is possible when the Spirit of God begins to do a work in your life. So don't miss what I'm telling you. Spiritual maturity isn't about what you're doing for God. It's about what God is doing inside of you. And so I want to kind of, as the semester comes to a close, what I want to talk about tonight is I just want to talk about the miraculous work of the Spirit of God in our lives. Like, I want to unpack for you the Spirit of God. And you might have questions around the Spirit of God because the Spirit of God is the least understood person in what is known as the Godhead. Many of us get God the Father. We learn the Lord's Prayer, our Father who is in heaven. We understand the Son, that Jesus Christ died on a cross, was buried, rose from the dead. But when it comes to the Spirit of God, things get a little fuzzy. And so many of us believe that the Spirit of God is just about our feelings, but it's not quite that. And so some of us just swing hard towards whatever we feel must be the Spirit, and then others of us swing towards Father, Son, Holy Bible, because we're like, we get the Father, we get the Son, the Spirit freaks us out, and so we'll just cling to the Bible. And so what I want to do tonight is I want to unpack for you three things. Number one, the reality of the Spirit. Number two, the result of the Spirit. And number three, the right response to the Spirit of God. And the reason that I want to unpack for you the Spirit of God right here at the end of the semester is because, you know what, when I was in college, there were so many summers where when I left Aggieland, I had in Aggieland this great spiritual rhythm going, and then when I would leave, that rhythm would be disrupted. And so there were times over Christmas break or summer break where things would drift towards spiritual dryness. And I actually want you to have a summer where you grow up in your faith, that you progress towards spiritual maturity. But you have to be clear, spiritual maturity is not the product of spiritual activity. It's the result of spiritual availability. Okay? So we're looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 2. 1 Corinthians chapter 2 is just beautifully read for us, and I'm unpacking three things for you. The first thing that I just want to unpack for you is the realities of the Spirit. This is just the realities of the Spirit. And if you're here and you geek out on theological stuff, I'm warning you guys. Like, if you're here tonight and you're super into theology, you're going to listen tonight and you're going to be like, we just were scratching the surface, bro. Like, you should have taken us deeper. And then if you're not into theology, you're going to be like, tonight was a lot. So I can't win with either of you. I'm just going to do my best to kind of hit the middle. Okay, so the realities of the Spirit is hopefully going to strengthen your theological understanding of the Spirit. So I'm asking you to engage on a high level mentally as we go through 1 Corinthians chapter 2. The first reality of the Spirit is this: the Spirit orchestrates conversion. When I say that the Spirit orchestrates conversion, I'm saying that the Spirit of God plays an integral role in anyone coming to faith. If you are here tonight and you consider yourself a follower of Jesus Christ, you need to know you're a follower of Jesus Christ because the Spirit of God did a miraculous work in your life. Here we go. Look with me, chapter 2, starting in verse 1. It's going to take a moment for me to kind of build the case that the Spirit of God orchestrates conversion, but watch it. Paul is writing to the people of Corinth, and he says this: I, when I came to you, brothers, did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom. So we're just going to walk verse by verse through the verses in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, and what you need to understand is Paul is writing to the city of Corinth, and the city of Corinth was a city that prized rhetoric. And so orators and rhetoricians were like traveling speakers and philosophers, and they would come to town and they would set up shop, and people would flock to hear these rhetoricians, these orators speak, and they would fanboy and fangirl over these orators, and they would pay money to hear from them, and they would just drink up everything that they spoke. Now the problem was that people valued the delivery just as much, if not more, than the content. So people didn't care as much about what was being said, they just cared about how it was being said. And so the more eloquent the speech, the more fame that an orator would get. But the first visit to town was the most important because you established your first impression. So if you showed up and you crushed your talk, then you would get a massive following and people would be really into you. And so it was all about delivery. And what Paul is saying is, hey, I didn't do what was culturally profitable to me. Like when I came to you and I talked to you about the testimony of God, he says I didn't do it with lofty speech or wisdom. So what Paul is saying is I didn't do what you would expect someone who comes and speaks, I didn't do what you would expect them to do. Verse 2, he says, for I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. Now, what Paul is saying is I delivered to you the gospel. The gospel is that Jesus Christ died, was buried, and rose from the dead. Here's why that was a problem. Okay, he's speaking into a society that values power and fame. So if there is a right way to God, then the people of Corinth would want to find their way to God through power, through prestige, through the intellect. And what does Paul come and proclaim? He comes and proclaims that Jesus Christ, the person we should put all of our hope in a sense was conquered. So think about, he's speaking to an audience that has Jews and Greeks in it. So for Jews were waiting on a Messiah that would come and be a conquering king. Paul's message is the person that you thought would be a conquering king actually was conquered. And he endured the most shameful form of death at the time. And so for Greeks valued power and fame, and what you have is you have Jesus who was crucified like a criminal. And so when you put verses 1 and 2 together, what you have is Paul saying like, look, guys, remember, when I came to you, my message was basic. And my message to an audience that values power and fame was a message of perceived weakness, that Jesus Christ was crucified. Verse 3, and I was with you in weakness, and in fear and in much trembling. And so what we're really finding out here is like no one was taking selfies with Paul. Like no one's taking a picture of Paul speaking and posting it to their story with fire emojis. Because Paul is doing the exact opposite of what would have been culturally acceptable. But he says in verse 4, "And my speech and my message were not implausible words of wisdom, but in demonstration," watch this, "but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might not rest." That word rest in the Greek, it means to have its being. So that your faith might not have its being in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. So do you see what Paul is saying? He's saying, when I came, I didn't try and preach the lights out of this place. He says, when I came, you know what I did is I put my trust in the Spirit of God to move and to work. Paul says, I wanted the Spirit of God to work through me, and then I wanted the Spirit of God to do a work in you so that when you put your faith in Jesus, it's not because you came and heard Paul speak. It's not so that you say, oh my gosh, have you heard Paul preach? He crushes it. I don't like listening or podcasting anyone except Paul. No, he says, I came and I told you about Jesus, and I trusted the Spirit of God to move so that if you put your trust in Jesus, it wouldn't be because of me, it'd be because of the Spirit of God. And what do you have? You have a church in Corinth full of people who have put their trust in Jesus because they listened to Paul preach a message with a delivery that was very unimpressive. How do you explain that? Because the Spirit orchestrates conversion. The Spirit of God did a miracle in the lives of the people of Corinth. And so if you're here tonight and you consider yourself a follower of Jesus Christ, you're a Christian because the Spirit of God did a miraculous work inside of you. The Spirit of God has opened up your eyes and opened up your mind and opened up your heart to understand the beautiful realities of the gospel. The scriptures refer to that as being born again, like a birth takes place because the Spirit of God does a miracle in your life. So you're not a Christian just because you came to Breakaway or you went to church and you heard the message and you decided that it was a fit for you. No, that would be like you coming up afterward and being like, hey, TA, where were you born? What if I told you, you know what, I chose to be born in Dallas? Wouldn't you be like, huh? Like Carla Atik gets credit for your birth. Like she chose to have you in Medical City in Dallas. But like I didn't have anything to do with that. And it's the same with your faith. Your faith, your salvation is a reality because the Spirit of God has done a miracle in your life. So that's the first reality of the Spirit. The Spirit orchestrates conversion. Now, here's the deal. In verse 6, Paul kind of goes a new direction. And I need you to know, like I'm going to walk verse by verse through it, but it's kind of a clunky passage. There's so much benefit to us just studying the Bible together. If this is your first breakaway ever, we're just a Bible study. We just open up the Word of God and we just walk verse by verse. We explain it, we understand it, then we apply it. But it's going to feel kind of clunky. We're trying to get to verse 10. That's going to show us the second reality of the Spirit. So just track with me. Watch this. Verse 6, he kind of pivots his argument and he says this, yet among the mature, that word mature is just referring to anyone who has put their trust in Jesus Christ and therefore has the Spirit of God living inside of them. Yet among the mature, we do impart wisdom, although it is not a wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age who are doomed to pass away. So what Paul is saying when he says that among the mature we do impart wisdom, that word wisdom is just a reference to the gospel. It's a reference to the fact that Jesus Christ died, was buried, and rose from the dead to give life. Now you have to understand, in the city of Corinth prized wisdom, yet they thought that the gospel was foolishness. And so Paul is saying we do impart wisdom, but it is not a wisdom that people who don't know Jesus would look at and be like, oh man, that's good stuff. Like, I better write that down. No, people might look at it and consider it foolishness. So that's why Paul says it's not a wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age who are doomed to pass away. He's just basically saying, like, the gospel, the beautiful realities of the gospel were not birthed out of or within the confines of this material world. Like the beautiful gospel that we share within Christianity wasn't the result of some orator or some king like going away to the mountains or sitting on a beach and listening to the Braveheart soundtrack and just having this revelation of, I need to tell people about a man named Jesus who died on a cross and rose from the dead. No, that's not where it came from. No, it's from God. He says in verse 7, we impart a secret and hidden wisdom of God, which God decreed before the ages for our glory. None of the rulers of this age understood this, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. So what he's saying is that the gospel to some people in this world is utter foolishness. And we know that because people crucified the God of the universe. That's how you know that some people see it as foolishness, is that they look at God in the flesh and they hang him on a cross like a criminal. He says, but as it is written, verse 9, what no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the heart of man imagined, what God has prepared for those who love him. He's just basically saying the realities of the gospel are something that no one has ever seen or heard or ever imagined in their heart. This isn't man-made. This isn't that it's not someone just got a waft of inspiration and we're like, you know what, I've got something to tell you. Verse 10. Here it is. We made it to verse 10. These things God has revealed to us through the Spirit. So we know the gospel because of the Spirit of God. So the second reality, remember, we're talking about the realities of the Spirit first. So the first reality was that the Spirit orchestrates conversion. The second reality is this: the Spirit is God and knows God fully. Okay? So this is just, again, dialing in on your theology. The Spirit is God and knows God fully. Why do I say that? Look with me at verse 10. Paul says, for the Spirit searches everything, even the depths of God. For who knows a person's thoughts except the spirit of that person which is in him? So Paul is just making the point, like, no one knows what you're thinking except you, right? Like, you might look like you're listening to me right now, but some of you are thinking about something totally outside of Reed Arena. Or like you can sit in your class and you can look to your professor like you are listening when you're actually thinking about something else. You can be eating lunch or you can be on a date and it can look like you are fully engaged, but you're not. Like, I have people ask me at times, hey, do you ever think about random things when you're speaking on stage? And I probably shouldn't tell you this, but the answer is yes. Like, there are times where, like, I'm fully into what I'm saying and I'm excited about what God is sharing through me, and yet there are times that I'm thinking about how good Cane's is going to taste after I finish my sermon on Sunday. Like, I'm just being honest with you. Like, tonight, Fuego is going to taste amazing. I'm just telling you that I can have that thought and you would never know that, because only I know my thoughts and only you know your thoughts. And so Paul's point is the Spirit knows the thoughts of God, but only you know your thoughts. So kind of put those ideas together. The Spirit knows the thoughts of God. Why? Because he is God. Like, the Spirit isn't some impersonal force. The Spirit of God is a person. The Spirit is God and knows God fully. Now, I want you to see the connection between 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and Romans chapter 11, okay? Listen to what Paul says in Romans chapter 11. This is amazing. He says in Romans 11, Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments, how inscrutable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor? So do you hear what Paul is saying in Romans 11? He's saying that God's riches and his wisdom are beyond our comprehension. They're too deep. Like, who can search God's judgments? Who can scrutinize his ways? Who has known the mind of the Lord? And Paul answers his own question in 1 Corinthians chapter 2. What's the answer? The Spirit of God. Oh, the depths of the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments. Well, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 10, for the Spirit searches everything, even the depths of God. Who has known the mind of the Lord? Well, verse 11. Who knows a person's thoughts except the spirit of that person which is in him? So also no one comprehends the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. So do you see it? The Spirit is God and knows God fully. Okay, there's a progression here. So track with me on this. The Spirit is God and knows God fully. The third reality of the Spirit is this: the Spirit indwells every believer. So when you put your trust in Jesus Christ, God actually sends the Spirit to live inside of you. That's verse 12. What does Paul say? He says, now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we might understand the things freely given us by God. So do you see the progression? The Spirit is God. The Spirit fully understands God. And now the Spirit comes and lives inside of us to bring us to the fourth reality of the Spirit. The Spirit cultivates understanding and application of spiritual truth. That's what the Spirit does. The Spirit cultivates understanding and application of spiritual truth. Did you see it? Verse 12. But the Spirit who is from God. Now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we might understand the things freely given us by God. Verse 13, he just tells us how it plays out practically. Verse 13, and we impart this in words not taught by human wisdom, but taught by the Spirit, interpreting spiritual truths to those who are spiritual. So see the progression. The Spirit is God, knows God fully. The Spirit comes and lives inside of us. Why? So that we can fully understand. And so what Paul just said is, you know what? Those who are spiritual, we speak truth to those who are spiritual. So the idea is when we gather together or you go to church, the hope is that whoever's standing on the stage has first met with God, and the Spirit of God has hopefully spoken to me and shown me spiritual truth from the Word. And as I speak it to you, the hope is that the Spirit of God is at work in you, helping you understand that truth, so that then you can leave and apply it. Verse 14, Paul says, the natural person, the person who doesn't have the Spirit of God living inside of him, does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for their folly to him, and he's not able to understand them because they are spiritually discerned. What he's saying is, if you don't have the Spirit of God living inside of you, then the things of Jesus will not make sense. Like, the Christian life should make zero sense to people who do not have the Spirit of God living inside of them. Like, that is why not having sex until marriage will seem crazy if you don't know Jesus. Like, it seems like utter foolishness. or why Christians don't get wasted on the weekend. It makes zero sense when you're in college for you to not do that if you don't have the Spirit of God living inside of you. Now, on the flip side, if you're a Christian, now don't miss this. If you're tuned out, tune in. If you're a Christian and your life makes perfect sense to an unbeliever, something is terribly wrong. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, if you're a follower of Jesus Christ and the Spirit of God lives inside of you and your life makes perfect sense to an unbeliever, something is malfunctioning in your life. The Spirit cultivates understanding and application of spiritual truth. Verse 15, Paul says, the spiritual person judges all things, but is himself to be judged by no one. Verse 16, for who has understood the mind of the Lord so as to instruct him? Okay, that verse is being pulled out of the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, the answer to that question is no one. Who has understood the mind of the Lord so as to instruct him? The answer, no one. But now, because of Jesus, Paul says, but we have the mind of Christ. So we've talked about the realities of the Spirit. What are the realities of the Spirit? The Spirit orchestrates conversion. The Spirit is God and knows God fully. The Spirit indwells every believer, and the Spirit cultivates understanding and application of spiritual truth. Those of you who are theologically bent in here, you're like, dude, we're just scratching the surface. If you're not into theology, you're like, bro, come up for air. Like, it's just too much. But what I hope is you have a deeper understanding now of just the role that the Spirit of God plays in the life of the believer. Those are the realities of the Spirit. So now I just want to talk about what is the result of having the Spirit of God live inside of you. Well, Paul told us what it was right there at the end of verse 16. What does he say? He says, but we have the mind of Christ. The result of having the Spirit live inside of you is that you can think how Jesus thinks. You have the mind of Christ. And this actually changes everything. Like, this is the truth that will change your life, is coming to an understanding that you have the mind of Christ. The reason I say that is I'll explain it this way. Growing up, my dad is a clinical psychologist, which means that I had free therapy growing up, and I needed a lot of free therapy growing up. So that was super helpful that my dad was a psychologist. And I will never forget my dad sitting me down one time, and he just said, hey, what you think will determine what you feel. And what you feel will determine what you do. What you think will determine what you feel, and what you feel will determine what you do. And you might hear that and say, well, that's just psychology. No, that's the Bible. Because what does Paul say in Romans chapter 12, verse 2? He says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed. How are you transformed? By the renewal of your mind. When your mind is renewed, your feelings are renewed. When your feelings are renewed, your actions are renewed. What you think determines what you feel, and what you feel determines what you do. So I just want to define for you spiritual maturity right now. If you want to know what the definition of spiritual maturity is, if you want to know what it looks like to be a spiritually mature person, if you are in here and you consider yourself a spiritually mature person, then it's probably good for you to make sure that your understanding of spiritual maturity is an accurate understanding of spiritual maturity. Spiritual maturity, this is it. Spiritual maturity is simply thinking how God thinks. That's it. That's spiritual maturity. And you're like, no, that's not enough. Like, it's got to be more than that. No, that's it. Spiritual maturity is simply thinking how God thinks. Because think about it, when you think how God thinks, you're going to feel how God feels. And when you feel how God feels, you're going to do what God would do. That's it. Spiritual maturity can be boiled down to simply thinking how Jesus thinks, because when you think like Jesus thinks, you're going to feel how Jesus feels, and you're going to do what Jesus does. So if you want to take some ground in your struggle against sin, then just think how Jesus thinks. So if you struggle with lust, then just ask the question. If you're struggling, if you're walking across campus and you begin to look lustfully at a guy or a girl, just ask this question: what does Jesus think about that guy or that girl? Or if you struggle with pornography, just ask the question: what does Jesus think about pornography? What does Jesus think about the guy or the girl that you look at walking across campus? Well, he or she has been made in his image. And so Jesus gives that person great amounts of worth and dignity. Jesus Christ went to the cross to make payment for that person's sin. He conquered the grave for that person. He has great plans for that person. He has brought many of those people into the family of God. So it's possible that that guy is your brother in Christ, or that woman is your sister in Christ. How does Jesus view pornography? Well, how does he view the people in pornographic films? Well, he made them in his image. They have great worth and great dignity. And when you look at them just for your gratification, you're stripping them of that dignity. If you're in some drama with a friend and you're gossiping about that friend, just ask yourself, how does Jesus think about that person? Well, he cares deeply about them. He went to the cross for them. He did something so significant so that they could be forgiven by a holy God. I'm just telling you, when any sin that you're struggling with, just trace it up to the lie that you're believing. Don't just manage the behavior. Trace it up to the initial thought, the lie that's driving the sin. Because when you identify the lie, you can replace it with the truth, and that truth will change the way that you feel, and that feeling will change the way that you act. That's the result of the Spirit, is you have the mind of Christ. So what's the right response to the Spirit? We've talked about the realities of the Spirit. We've talked about the result of the Spirit. So let's just land on the right response to the Spirit. This has everything to do with your summer. This is all about you growing in your faith over the summer. What does it look like as you get closer and closer to finals? What does it look like for you to respond to the Spirit? What does it look like for you to pursue intimacy with God? Well, just remember, the goal isn't activity, it's availability. The goal is not activity, the goal is availability. So I just want to encourage you to do 3 things, which sounds wrong because I just said it's not about activity. But I'm telling you to do 3 things. Here they are. Number 1, sit with him. Sit with him. You can't know God's ways without knowing his word. And so I just encourage you, create more space. Create more space in your days to sit and to listen to God by reading his word. But then as you read his word, just sit for a moment and ask the Spirit of God what he wants to say to you through the word. Create that space where sometimes we sacrifice intimacy for the sake of efficiency. And so we just want to get it done. You know what, I got 5 minutes. Let me just read real quick and let me get out the door. We sacrifice intimacy for efficiency. But I'm telling you, the joy is found in sitting with Jesus and asking his Spirit to speak to you. So let me just encourage you. Just create more space in your day. I want to encourage you to just sit. Try and sit still for 5 minutes. Try and sit quietly for 5 minutes. Do nothing for 5 minutes. But to just sit after you've read the word, just sit and listen and allow the Spirit of God to speak into your life. Sit with him. Number 2, ask of him. Ask the Spirit of God to show you where the gospel is not being applied in your life. James Wilhoit talks about the gospel not just being a source of transportation, but this source of transformation. The gospel isn't just what gets us into heaven. The gospel is what gets heaven into us now. Like, we need to remind ourselves of the gospel every single day. Like, as we've moved to Dallas and I'm in a new church and a new setting, you know what has crept up into my life? A fear of man and a need for people's approval. And if I'm not careful, the stage that I step onto at Watermark Community Church can become an audition stage for me. And so when that has happened, what I've had to realize is that there's a lack of application of the gospel in my life. Because when Jesus Christ hung on that cross, what he was declaring was my value and my worth. God the Father was saying, this is what you are worth to me. You are now worth the body and blood of Jesus Christ. But if I treat the stage like an audition stage, what I'm looking for is value. But God has already freely given me my value. And so when I get on that stage and I audition for people, you know what I'm doing? Is I'm chasing approval when the reality is that approval's been chasing me through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So I just encourage you, ask the Spirit of God, ask him, where is the gospel not being applied in my life? And then third, surrender to him. Sit with him, ask of him, and surrender to him. I'll explain it this way, and I used this example back in the fall, but I want to use it again. It's the difference between allowing the Spirit of God to rent or to own in your life. We just moved to Dallas, and right now we're in a rental house. And the reason that that's tough is that the house doesn't belong to us, which means we can't do to the house what we want to do to the house. Like, there's wallpaper on walls that we would change if we could. There are walls that I would take a sledgehammer to and just completely remove if it was my house, but it's not my house. So you know what we do? We just do the best we can with a home that doesn't belong to us. And yet when we lived in College Station, we owned our home. And my wife has watched enough HGTV to know what it is like to make that home her own. And so you're either going to come to the Spirit of God, you're either going to realize tonight as a follower of Jesus Christ that the Spirit of God lives in you, and you're going to look at the Spirit and say, hey, you know what? You can rent, but you can't own. Like, I'm glad that you're living inside of me, but I don't want you tinkering with a bunch of stuff because I'm in college right now and I kind of want to just enjoy myself. And so I don't want you to touch this friend group aspect of my life. I don't want you to touch this dating relationship. I don't want you to touch what I'm doing on the weekends. I don't want you to touch my laziness in school. I just want to do what I want to do. You can rent, like you can occupy my life. You just can't change my life. Or you're going to let the Spirit of God own. You're going to live surrendered to him. And each day you're going to wake up and say, Spirit of God, you can have your way in me. And the Spirit will go to work in you and begin to change you and make you more like Jesus Christ. That's what he does really, really well. You want to be more like Jesus? You want to show up back at A&M in August looking more like Jesus? Sit with the Spirit of God. Ask of the Spirit of God. Surrender to the Spirit of God. Because spiritual maturity is a miracle. You cannot grow on your own. But spiritual maturity is not the result of spiritual activity. It's the result of spiritual availability. When you sit with him and ask of him and surrender to him, all you're saying is, I'm available. You can do whatever you want to do.